The days of elves and dragons are over, of knights in shining armor trotting curly-haired horses over the moors and rivers on their way home to blushing brides and noble retirement. The breeze no longer tosses wildflowers gaily, no longer catches the fair hair of the maiden or her bride. The king does not rule for past love of his kin and country, and the castle walls serve to contain rather than to protect. Duels are no longer fought for love or justice, but in the name of fear and hunger, equally so for the need to survive. No, the dragons are dead, and the elves a children's myth. The world rots now, its fragile veneer cracked and chafed until muscle and bone become visible to its inhabitants, nay, its prisoners. The sky itself is discovered to be torn by astronomers and raving doomsayers alike, revealing the darkness of what lies beyond, a void, neither heaven nor hell, a curtain parted that cannot be closed to hide the gaze of the old gods upon us. The moon bleeds, were it the moon at all, and how could it be when it seems to howl like a sickly child by the witching hour, and grow larger and closer by the day? Fear runs rampant as the plague, as the night begins to lengthen and strange beasts are seen circling in the sky. The last embers of the age of man are dying. Will there be no respite in the cold dark that awaits us? Dark fantasy is one of my favorite genres. It's one that I return to frequently, and its signature dungeon moss and cracked stone seems to guide my own work as frequently as it influences the art I love outside the genre. Passed through the synthesizers and dithering filters of yesteryear, this art is comfortable in its daunting allure. It feels like these worlds always have something new to experience, something to think about even when you're not wandering through them yourself. Challenging and punishing as the experience may be, there's catharsis in committing to a journey, knowing full well that you will not be the same person when you come out the other side, if you make it out at all. Recently, I've been patching gaps in my understanding of the genre, and falling further in love with it at every turn. Every step I take to immerse myself in these grim worlds, I feel like I'm filling in pieces of a bigger picture that shapes the way I want to approach art in every form I find it. Dark Souls being one of the biggest influences on modern dark fantasy mechanics, on top of my own artistic sensibilities, makes a perfect flagstone piece to jump from. Mapping my way by hand, I dove into From Software's 90s catacombs and ventured through Kingsfield and Shadow Tower. I got hooked by the obtuse mechanics, the insistence on engaging each game on its own level, and piecing together a story through atmosphere and loose scraps of world building. It was like taking an art history class, seeing them pull tricks and conceptualize visual designs that they would continue to iterate on through to their modern day. Down to the very mechanics, these games feel dangerous in a way that's wholly engaging and somehow still feels unique as we approach their 30th anniversary later this year. I learned I loved the danger, missed it in a certain way. Fantasy used to feel dangerous, didn't it? The leather-bound Necronomicons, the torn, tea-stained pages, the insistence on crafting a world that felt at once maximalized and also ever so empty. Nothing felt like it was off the table as the classic sword and sorcery tropes met surreal design decisions and pivoted into power-hungry conspiracies and dark secrets hidden behind false walls, guarded by things neither living nor dead. It felt like anything was possible, but it would take work to find the limits of these worlds, both on the part of my hero and myself as I struggled to piece together what was happening, much more where I was at any given moment. Through my experiences, I've been thinking about why the design of these games is so impactful. The fact is that From Software is the only studio making this kind of dark fantasy in the AAA space, and most of the other smaller examples are directly birthed from Dark Souls-inspired design philosophy and subsequent popularity over the studio's previous releases. I realized, comparing aesthetics between the greatly extended Souls series and other popular genre pieces, that we've been slowly edging towards a more common fantasy vernacular, a set of terms that we've standardized when we talk about the genre, and have led us into what can almost be considered a pulp renaissance, a new standardization of the aesthetic of fantasy. The reason dark fantasy, and notably FromSoft's game design, sticks out so much is because it challenges what we've become so familiar with within the genre, as it's been melded to appeal to more general audiences, a gateway drug to make nerd culture acceptable through frictionless design choices and a prestige vision that may be predictable, but feels comfortable and timeless nonetheless. We've become accustomed to what fantasy should look and feel like, with the monopolization of Lord of the Rings, 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons, and the smashing popularity of Skyrim, The Witcher 3, now Baldur's Gate 3. We've come to expect a romantic world, a sandbox that can be fleshed out through every inch as we see fit, a world that feels alive and reacts to our presence as we are a notable hero that should be reacted to. Even when that world is broken, our comfort subverted, we exist to fix it, to cast out the evils and return to a former glory. Survival is a given, and the journey becomes focused more on what we as the hero gain along the way, rather than how it inherently changes us. This common vernacular, pulpification, dictates that when we hear dragon, we have a clear image of what that word means, and where we, embodying the hero archetype, fit into the vocabulary surrounding it. We know what dragons do, and should be done with, what they imply both mechanically and as a narrative tool on several layers, as a monster, a metaphor, a creature older and wiser than time itself. We have also been given well-tread archetypes of each fantasy class, doubled-down tropes distilling each type of character into a clear image of what a barbarian or bard should look and act like. We hear a rogue's tragic backstory, followed by a quip lampshading the fact that we know it and know what comes next in the redemption arc after the call to adventure. We follow through anyways because these characters have always existed and we have always loved them, because they represent pieces of ourselves that we pull out and amplify and place into scenarios made specifically to succeed in, if just by a hair. Then our hero's journey ends, not without their due losses of course, but those necessary, even beneficial sacrifices are generally overshadowed by the rewards at the end, and the humility gained by giving something up for the greater good. Dented armor is polished back to its former glory, a sword is sheathed and wounds dressed. A kiss is planted as the camera pulls out through a window and catches a bird singing on a branch before it flies up and away over the world that has been saved and thrives again. This world is good. This world represents peace and justice and love. It feels right to simply exist in this space and enact the vocabulary of familiar fantasy, balancing the scales and coming out on top. It is a romantic journey in any and many ways, a road that has been worn too thoroughly not to be upkept and walked again with fresh paving and a change of attitude over time. Of course, these stories are not flawed for existing in the same space as each other, following the same beats and overlapping motifs. This is simply an aesthetic, but it's one that exists as a default option in a limitless space that we're beginning to realize has more potential, and has had more in previous generations, only to be reeled back as target audiences change and media trends dictate. When presented with this standardized vocabulary, it feels so much more fresh when the tropes are subverted, when a world is taken back to square one and forced to recontextualize its mechanics instead of relying on the visuals laid out and explained so thoroughly by others. It's a sort of tokenization. Once again, we simply hear the word dragon and we visualize a dragon down to every scale. When we step back and describe things as they are, instead of what they're called, we start to reconnect with the fantastical concepts we're using, and freshen our understanding of what the genre is working with. Consider a manticore. If we're following the common vernacular, we speak about it like it's a real creature that we should already be familiar with, only stopping to use supplementary descriptions to describe how horrifying this particular manticore is, instead of the very concept of one. Fantasy isn't supposed to bend to the presupposition that we know what's being talked about. The dragon should not just be another creature in the picture book, in the same way as a manticore should be an object of horror. The face of a man weaving from the shadows, followed by the jagged form of two wings sprouting from its cat-like frame. It opens its mouth, betraying its humanoid features as it splits past the cheekbones, revealing rows of shark-like teeth. True, we're describing the same thing, but just by the act of picking it apart, we defamiliarize it just enough to make it more engaging. It's easy to see why so much dark fantasy overlaps with cosmic horror, opting into the realm of the indescribable and inexplicable, because in the end, fantasy itself should feel alien and mesmerizing to us, reminding us that we do not understand it even if we find comfort and beauty in it. Writer Emery Glass, in her article A Crash Course on Writing Dark Fantasy, attempts to define a ratio to encapsulate the genre as much as is possible. It's hard to pin down what dark fantasy is, especially when most stories use pieces of horror to elevate a contained moment, and so much of dark fantasy itself seems to blend into science fantasy, which in turn begs the question of what the difference is between science fantasy and flat science fiction. These genre tags are too nebulous, as most tend to be, and so we'll define the range of fantasy to a medieval era scale. In the addition of science fantasy to be an inclusion of technology that is man-made and electric rather than magic or strictly astronomical. This will allow us to draw a clear line between where cosmic horror works itself into fantasy, not skewing sword and sorcery into science fantasy simply for the inclusion of celestial beings, as they are magical rather than technological. In terms of dark fantasy itself, Glass posits a 2-to-1 ratio for fantasy to horror elements, using the 3 pillars of the story: tone, narrative, and setting, one of which will always skew primarily into horror. Much like genre tags, it can be difficult to parse these 3 pillars, as so often they inform each other on a basic level and thus are difficult to define as individual pieces. But the conversation becomes much easier when we look into just how much the inclusion of horror into one pillar taints the other two, while still placing itself foremost. Often a story with one pillar will slowly incorporate more pieces of the others, but what matters most is how the story begins. The first, and maybe the mildest pillar, is tone. Focusing the horror element into your story's tone results in something that feels slightly more contained, a war story or an adventure significantly more grim than the rest, but a part of a larger picture that isn't necessarily all dark fantasy. Fear and Hunger and Plastibu's VERMIS game guides are a good example of focusing the horror into the tone, as both of these pieces take a generally commonplace fantasy setting and narrative, and inject them with more horrific implications as we begin to pick apart how these adventures would make a psychological impact on their brave heroes. Fear and Hunger became quickly popular for its grim take on the mechanics of a dungeon crawl RPG, presenting a classic dungeon setting with classical fantasy archetypes, then slowly picking away at them by following the world's rules, as dictated by carnal elder gods that quickly grow bored with their domain. The game explores the implications of gods dedicated to carnal instincts, violence and sexuality pushed to their limits by followers seeking enlightenment, as well as the effects of these indulgences on the body and the world itself. Furthermore, the game explores a darker take on the effects of magic on the body and mind, as the heroes slip further into the titular fear and hunger, and necessitate vices to stay sane in such a terrible place as this. Plastibu's VERMIS books, gaining popularity for their unique presentation and mysterious nature, are guides for retro fantasy games that never existed. Much like Fear and Hunger, VERMIS provides a world that feels familiar, with characters and a quest that pose surreal doubles to the archetypes we know, but a dark undercurrent permeates every design and begins to play at our expectations. The fog rolling across every page seems to pour over the illustrations and into the very text, as information is cleverly left out to keep us on edge. Everything is tinted in a way that forces us to squint at shapes in the distance that may or may not be there, but just the question has already planted a seed in our minds and forced us to reconsider the steps we take further into this adventure. Either of these worlds could easily be played through the lens of a regular fantasy story, but everything is picked apart and exaggerated or excluded to fortify the overall tone, effectively extinguishing the torches we would normally use to find our way in order to hide paths in darkness and trip us up. This lack of complete information, of challenged expectations and nebulous risk and reward, creates a sense of unease that highlights just how different these worlds are from our own. A necessary push away from imaginative historical fiction and into real, actual fantasy, with all of the connotations of the mechanics of a mystical adventure presented in a way that feels realistically and reasonably dangerous and uncertain. This danger paves the way for us to imagine greater evils hiding just outside our view, ready to jump out at any moment and challenge our commitment to the journey even further. In this uncertainty, the world's boundaries are unclear and allude to the possibility of bigger rifts the further we go. This is just the first step. The problem with discerning a horror narrative is that tone and setting generally follow closely, so it's more difficult to pick out pieces that exclusively have a horror narrative and don't necessarily commit to the tone or setting. This is where we get maybe the most common form of mainstream dark fantasy, taking the form of segues from longer form entertainment where the story can tangent into different genres when the main narrative allows, or else lulls. Generally, a horror narrative is used as one last attempt to push the heroes out of their comfort zone and signify that the journey has brought them further than they ever thought possible, challenging them both physically and psychologically. We see this kind of thing in almost every piece of fantasy, almost an obligatory addition of animated skeletons or sorrowful ghosts and surreal nightmares. Most folklore fits into this category as well, keeping a whimsical tone to fit the standards of a bedtime story and realistic elements to make itself feel more relatable, but often threading in horrific elements to teach a lesson. Hubris or failure met with gruesome threats meant to contrast the innocence of the protagonists or viewers. Arguably, this is also why some people call the Witcher series dark fantasy, due to most of its darker elements being taken directly from Eastern European folklore, and spanning the duration of a side plot as an easy way to remind you that the world is dangerous, but so are our heroes. Most fantasy that takes elements from folklore only bridges on dark and gritty, but due to the fact that folklore is a million small stories, some horrific but just as often whimsical and romantic, any inspiration usually balances itself between these elements too much to commit to being flat horror. Ideally, a horror narrative exists to break down characters, or provide a warning to characters that are already broken and seeking redemption. The story exists as a purgatory meant to test the limits of a guilty hero's psyche, or else their commitment to the concept of justice as the world grows indifferent and the things they love become fragile. These characters are pulled deeper into the darkness than they ever have been in their previous exploits, discovering darker truths about the world that change the way that they view it, and themselves. Generally, this kind of horror narrative is the second stage in the state of the fantasy world being tainted. A Patient Zero story as a greater evil attempts to take advantage of the grimness of the world and change the setting to fit its own image. We see this occur in Berserk and Between Two Fires, two examples of more focused horror narratives that use common fantasy characters and setting to contrast the supernatural corruption happening beyond the veil. As the audience, we know what's going to happen, but the characters do not. In turn, the tone and setting exist to create contrast and tension between what we're familiar with and what we know is waiting around the corner for our protagonists. The most permeating option of the three is to build a story up from a horror setting, a final stage of darkness tainting the land, making it miserable and hopeless. Vampiric castles loom in the distance, gravestones spiking the hills, and bodies hanging from trees, the dirt itself corrupted and incapable of holding the dead in place. Often a horror setting is immediately identifiable based on its legacy, adapting tropes of classical horror and allowing the narrative and tone to naturally rise up from those building blocks. We know what to expect from a dilapidated manor in a graveyard, just as much as when we see bats flying from a castle silhouetted by moonlight. Everything that happens next is only natural as the setting does its job. Series like Castlevania and Ghosts and Goblins are a natural pairing, as most of their respective horror is derived from the setting rather than the mechanics or the overarching narrative of save the world, save the princess, and the fact that failure is not a concern because heroes like this always prevail, and if they don't, another one eventually will. Part of the fun of a horror setting is creating a conceptual contrast between the archetypes that you put into it. Much like romantic fantasy, we want to see the hero succeed, the paladin of light challenging the undead king, or the crude rogue placed into the shoes of a hero purely by contrast of the wickedness around them. The Dungeons & Dragons module Curse of Strahd is a classic example of this, presenting a perfect opportunity to test the strength of a horror setting, by nature of being a tabletop game and inherently employing sandbox rules based on player choice. Unlike the Witcher series or other previously mentioned pieces that bend away from dark fantasy through the diversity of player choice or quantity of inspirations, Curse of Strahd's narrative and tone can be shifted away from horror based on how the players decide to interact with the world and each other, but the setting is consistently dark and provides tension even in moments of levity. Within the boundaries of the sandbox, every problem is inevitably caused by the corruption of the setting, as the tyrant vampire sits in his castle and continues to mold the land to his comfort. Glass's 2-to-1 rule is not all encapsulating, as the concepts of a horror narrative, setting, and tone can be subjective and often bleed into each other too much, but a commitment to those facets can be felt clearly. This is why a comedic playthrough of Curse of Strahd is still easily considered dark fantasy, because that module commits so fully to the horror setting that nothing can bypass the intention of the world, even your players. This is also why I don't think games like The Witcher 3, Baldur's Gate 3, and Skyrim count as dark fantasy, regardless of visual flares they employ, because they don't commit to their darker elements out of an attempt to prioritize player freedom through longer form content, which dictates the primary narrative of their respective settings. You could play these games in a way that prioritizes dark fantasy elements, but in doing so you ignore the majority of the world that is romantic or epic above all else. They edge too far into fantasy narrative to count the horror narrative as anything but circumstantial, or otherwise tangential. Now we've established the three pillars of a dark fantasy story, but what kind of content do they encapsulate? What makes dark fantasy feel special outside of its aesthetic qualities? In the act of imbalancing the scales of fantasy, tearing apart the invincible hero trope, we must set everything on equal grounds. Here, design bibles like Dark Souls are paramount. The dragon still exists, the undead legions that make easy fodder for an inexplicable mechanical force of evil, but they're recontextualized to add gravity and dispel the myth of the untouchable hero. In the long run, we, the protagonist, are just as likely to succeed as we are to fail, and failure makes us human. In showing that failure firsthand, both on the part of the player and the creatures we interact with, a friction is created between our expectations of the world and how we begin to interact with it, and peel away its layers to reveal more depth beneath the tropes presented. Failure is inherent, a literal feature of the landscape as much as its occupants. Everything is breaking, and as it breaks, we get to look deeper into the cracks and find darker secrets, layers beyond layers, mankind at the center of a cosmic conspiracy beyond our understanding, playing our role in a grander cycle, lest we can miraculously find a way to break or somehow rise above it. This rebalancing is often misconstrued for cruelty or some kind of masochistic search for punishment. In reality, dark fantasy does not seek penitence or submission. Rather, the knowledge that you are not above any challenge grants every decision another layer of gravity. Anything could be a potential failure, and so you must first decide which decisions are worth pursuing given your known capabilities, and second, recognizing when running away is the better option. Dark tropes are often described like spice. Too much and it makes the meal inedible, but just enough and it becomes unforgettable. Some may take the wrong lessons from Dark Souls' legacy, that pain is pleasure, but others understand that simply leveling the playing field can open up new levels of engagement that cannot be achieved when the player is not afraid of consequences. Consider the addition of mimics into a game, the knowledge that any chest could be trapped and fatally dangerous, but never which chest. If every chest, every treasure is a mimic in disguise, the player will no longer engage with the game in the same way, and will become frustrated at the unfair design. On the other hand, if 4 chests grant a reward, then the 5th bites down on their hands as they reach to open it, the punishment of hubris will stick with them for the rest of the experience, regardless of whether or not another mimic even exists in the world. There needs to be rest, a reward without punishment, but the player should always be wary when the option presents itself, for there is such a thing as too good to be true, in a world where desperation begets recklessness. When challenging works like Dark Souls and Fear and Hunger become popular, it isn't because they're difficult. Their worlds are not filled with mimics, but because they parse their challenges in ways that feel daunting in the bigger picture, but achievable when carefully considering your circumstances on a step-by-step basis, and then rewarding the deeper you delve. Yes, anything can be deadly, and there will be unfair cruelty, but the world is not without its rewards either, even if just the catharsis of overcoming a hurdle that once seemed impossible. This ties into the repeated importance of defamiliarization, picking fantasy tropes apart and making them feel unknown and fresh. Magic should be a dangerous, esoteric thing. It should not be able to be fully grasped, and it should have consequences. Dragons should exist as primeval creatures with unknown motivations and questionable wisdom. This reframes challenges by taking away the things we think we know about the world. What are the limits of magic, and how do they affect us when we push at them? What are these creatures fully capable of, and how should we approach them with that lack of knowledge? How much power are we willing to take if there is a potential equal sacrifice? Once we understand our vulnerability, the world itself grows 10 times larger, as do the rewards once we begin to find what's possible. When we talk about restraint in world design, a lack of clear boundaries between what is and what is not possible, we're talking about soft fantasy, a technique that bridges the gap between fantasy and horror and allows for a certain addition through subtraction. In the same way that we're taught not to show too much of a monster when crafting a horror, lest the audience sees too much and stops feeling tension, we have to rein in how much we mechanize fantasy tropes. Revealing too much about a fantastical world undermines the inherent mystery and wonder that comes with the genre, and makes the audience feel too secure in their understanding of the space to fully engage with the individual pieces. Dark fantasy obviously thrives with soft world building, as the less we're told, the more we're forced to speculate, both visually and mechanically. When the limits of the world are not apparent, we do not know when an attempt to delve further will be punished or rewarded. The Earthsea books are a prime example of this technique being used to build tension. Over the course of the first book, the protagonist is punished for tempting the undefined boundaries of magic and unleashing things that are not yet able to be understood. Punishment, in the attempt to reach beyond the perceived veil of the world and grasp for a reward. Again, FromSoft is another perfect point of reference, as their worlds are built to be beyond clear understanding, with only slight hints at a broader picture that often spawn more questions than answers. This makes it rewarding to search through the layers, or even just to become immersed in them without attempting to uncover their secrets. There will always be more depth for those that want to seek it out. In softening its boundaries, the setting begins to form itself into a character just as much as the cast you place into it. The world itself is being pushed and pulled by the viewer just as much as it pushes and pulls at the characters attempting to navigate it in turn. In order for dark fantasy to feel successful and satisfying, either the world or the characters need to be changed significantly, and often permanently. Again, in Dark Souls we get a choice, either change yourself forever or change the world. This is an integral part of Fear and Hunger as well, through the mechanics of enlightenment through marriage, the loss of limbs, or a connection to a god that changes who you are and what you are capable of on a core level. Bridging into survival horror, dark fantasy challenges your resources and must be used creatively, if not sparingly. Those resources include your very body and mind. There is no going back from this, so consider carefully what you're willing to sacrifice in order to survive, and if you're lucky, grow. With how integral the concept of change is to the genre, we begin to stretch how far that change can really go, especially within the realm of soft fantasy as we've established it. In common fantasy, the sense of change spans a brief spectrum of ideals. A rogue becoming a reluctant hero, a knight becoming exhausted by violence and seeking peace, a peasant given power and responsibility that challenges their sense of self, and often their sense of humility as they are presented a better option at the sacrifice of their kin. Dark fantasy begs characters to change on a deeper, more basic level, and begins to push the fear of changing too much, whether for the person presented with the opportunity, or for their friends and loved ones as they reach too far beyond the veil. The malignant threat of curses or magical boundaries breaking is a common tool in stories concerned with focusing on individual characters. Princess Mononoke and A Wizard of Earthsea tell stories about characters attempting to evade these magical banes before they are changed drastically by them. A step further and we see how Fear and Hunger's characters are changed by magic as the dungeon melds their body and psyche, sometimes going far enough that the doors of normal society will likely be closed soundly on their return. Between Dark Souls 1 and 3, the world itself changes drastically as the cosmic cycle keeping it alive begins to rust and catch on itself, and can no longer keep up, as even the landscape caves in on itself. Morkborg is similarly built on the world changing to reject the players, as the signs of the apocalypse begin to stack with failed rolls. When the world changes, it is a test of determination, intent on breaking the characters in order to consume them. There is no question of whether or not a character will break, only when. Next, either madness or enlightenment, and the cycle continues. Madness and psychological horror are a common mechanic when the world and characters reach this point, and fantasy blends into surrealism. Many of the enemies in FromSoft's games have been driven mad either by failure or the corruption of ultimate success. How do characters cope with drastic change, with the world shifting around them? How does the world itself cope? We say we fear death, but in reality, don't we fear what comes beyond death? What will our bodies do after we pass? What of our souls? Fearful as it is, death is not necessarily the end of the story. In fact, endings are frequently framed to be painful beginnings in disguise. We see this as the world cracks open and its horrid blood begins to run out, as humanity is forced to watch the sky tear and corpses rise, before it is inevitably snuffed out, ushering in a new era, or a continuation of a grim cosmic cycle as an old god dies and a new one is born. The thing that watches us blinks, slowly, before drifting back to sleep as its glazed eyelid once again becomes the moon, and night falls over a dead earth. In this night, it dreams, and with its dreams are planted seeds of new life, beautiful, primordial beings created in its image. In time, they learn how to crawl, then walk, then begin to slowly spread over this new world, filling in the cracks and discovering remnants of what was lost before. The cycle begins anew.